Imagine deceiving an entire enemy army into believing that thousands of soldiers, tanks, and planes were on their way, when in reality, it was all an elaborate trick. That's exactly what the US Ghost Army did during World War II. At first glance, their base might have looked like a movie set. Artists painting fake airplanes, actors reading out scripted radio transmissions, and soundtracks playing on a loop to create the illusion of an enormous military presence. However, this wasn't just a theatrical production, it was a real military operation with far-reaching consequences. Officially called the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops, the Ghost Army was a top-secret, highly specialized unit that used all kinds of sneaky tricks to confuse and mislead the Nazi forces during World War II. Made up of 1,100 soldiers, artists, engineers, sound techs, and actors, this wasn't your average military unit. Their mission was simple: to deceive the German army and make them think that Allied forces were in places they weren't, or that they were much larger than they actually were. This clever trickery gave real combat units the precious time they needed to move around and make their next moves without the Germans catching on. The idea behind the Ghost Army was developed by US Army planners Ralph Ingersoll and Billy Harris, with Colonel Harry L. Reeder leading the unit. The concept was inspired by British forces who had already pulled off some pretty successful deception tactics earlier in the war, particularly during the Battle of El Alamein in 1942 with Operation Bertram. The whole idea was simple but brilliant: create illusions that would totally mess with the enemy's perception of the battlefield. Instead of just charging headfirst into battle, the Ghost Army used their creativity and skills to turn the tables on the Nazis by making them believe the Allies were much stronger and much more widespread than they actually were. Ghost soldiers were encouraged to use their brains, creativity, and talent to baffle the German army. Many of the soldiers came from backgrounds that nurtured creative thinking: art schools, advertising agencies, and other professionals that valued outside-the-box ideas. The idea was inspired by the success of British subterfuge in North Africa. It was a mix of artists, ad men, actors, sound engineers, and professional soldiers handpicked for their creativity and brains. Their average IQ was 119. In civilian life, these ghost soldiers had been artists, architects, actors, set designers, engineers, and even lawyers. Their ability to think outside the box allowed them to develop some of the most imaginative and convincing military deceptions in history. The army had 4 units, 3 existing ones and 1 brand new one, and put them all under the leadership of Colonel Harry Reeder. He stayed in charge until the unit headed back to the US after their European operations wrapped up. The first unit was the 603rd Engineer Camouflage Battalion. This was the biggest group in the Ghost Army, made up of 379 men. Their job? Visual deception. They used inflatable rubber tanks, trucks, jeeps, and artillery to create the illusion of a large fighting force for the army to see from the air or from a distance. A lot of these guys had been doing camouflage work for a couple of years already, and many were artists who had been specially recruited for their skills in creating convincing visuals. The next unit was the Signal Company Special. This group, made up of 296 men, was all about radio deception, basically making fake radio traffic, known as spoof radio. The operators would pretend to be from real military units, even copying the way those operators sent Morse code, so the enemy never realized the real units were long gone and out of their reach. The 3132 Signal Service Company was the deception team, with 145 men who were all about making noise to confuse the enemy. Their job was to use big speakers mounted on half-tracks, those armored vehicles with wheels in front and tracks in the back, to play sounds of troops moving and equipment working all at night. They were trained at the Army Experimental Station in upstate New York before joining the rest of the Ghost Army in Normandy. Then there was the 406th Engineer Combat Company, led by Captain George Rebb. The 406th had 168 men who were the real deal when it came to combat. Their main role was to provide perimeter security for the rest of the Ghost Army, but they also handled construction and demolition work. They would dig tank and artillery positions to add to the illusion. Plus, they often used their bulldozers to create fake tank tracks as part of the visual deception. Training began at Camp Forest in Tennessee and Camp Pine in New York, now known as Fort Drum, where the soldiers were taught the art of military deception. Once their training was complete, the Ghost Army crossed the Atlantic in early May 1944, setting up camp near Stratford-upon-Avon in England to prepare for the invasion of Normandy. Their first major task came as part of Operation Fortitude, a critical deception designed to mislead the Germans about the location of the D-Day landings. The Ghost Army's job was to convince the Nazis that the Allies were preparing to land at Pas de Calais, miles away from the actual landing sites in Normandy. This misdirection was key to the success of D-Day, as it kept German forces divided and unable to respond effectively to the real invasion. A couple of weeks after D-Day, some members of the Ghost Army made their way to Normandy, where they staged a clever ruse by simulating a Mulberry Harbor at night. They used lights to make it seem like the Allies were unloading supplies and troops, which helped draw German artillery away from the actual harbors. Following that, the entire unit played a key role in tying down the German defenders of Brest, convincing them that a much larger Allied force was closing in on them than was actually the case. As the Allies pushed eastward toward Europe, so did the Ghost Army. They eventually set up in Luxembourg, from where they carried out deceptions involving crossings of the Ruhr River, positions along the Maginot Line, the Hürtgen Forest, and the final major crossing of the Rhine River. In each case, the Ghost Army used their tricks to pull German forces away from the real Allied operations, allowing the true forces to maneuver without interference. Although the Ghost Army was a relatively small unit with just 1,100 soldiers, it was equipped with some incredibly innovative tools borrowed from British forces. Equipped with inflatable tanks, fake airplanes, and massive loudspeakers, the Ghost Army created the illusion of a much larger force, sometimes as large as 30,000 men. These inflatable decoys, along with sound effects and fake radio chatter, were so convincing that they kept the German forces guessing, wasting precious time and resources chasing shadows. In reality, though, the Ghost Army's artillery couldn't fire, its tanks couldn't move, and its soldiers were far more skilled with paintbrushes than rifles. Yet, despite these limitations, the Ghost Army played a vital role in helping the Allies win World War II. Over the course of the war, they staged more than 20 elaborate ruses using inflatable decoys, sound effects, and fake radio signals. These deceptions fooled the Nazis and saved thousands of lives by distracting and misdirecting enemy forces. The Ghost Army would set up these elaborate setups, sometimes less than a quarter mile from the front lines, using inflatable tanks, loudspeakers blaring pre-recorded military sounds, and fake radio chatter. These performances were carried out with precision, sometimes under the nose of the enemy, but they were incredibly effective in keeping the Germans guessing and buying the Allies precious time. One of the Ghost Army's most significant victories came just before D-Day during Operation Fortitude. Their task was to convince the Nazis that the Allied invasion would occur at Pas de Calais, far from the actual landing site in Normandy. This clever misdirection was a crucial element in the success of the D-Day landings, as it kept German forces distracted and spread thin. Later, during the Battle of Bulge, the Ghost Army's tactics continued to be pivotal. Using deceptive broadcasts and strategically placed bar conversations designed to be overheard by German spies, they confused Nazi intelligence about Allied strength and positioning. This bought the real Allied forces much needed time to regroup and respond effectively. But perhaps the most ambitious and successful operation the Ghost Army executed was in March 1945 during Operation Viersen. In a bold deception, they managed to impersonate 2 full divisions, about 40,000 troops, by deploying 600 inflatable dummies, blasting recordings of pontoon bridge construction and artillery fire, and even creating fake command posts. The goal was to divert German attention away from the actual crossing of the Rhine by the Ninth Army. The ruse worked flawlessly. While the Germans attacked the inflatable decoys and illusions, the real troops crossed the Rhine largely unopposed, making a significant strategic gain. The Ghost Army used inflatable decoys in several key operations before the Allies landed in North Africa in 1941 and 1942, throughout Italy in 1943, and right before the D-Day landings in Normandy in 1944. These clever tricks were part of their plan to throw the enemy off track about where the real Allied forces were. Throughout their operations in the European theater, the Ghost Army's illusions continually drew enemy fire away from the actual Allied soldiers. It's estimated that their efforts saved between 15,000 and 30,000 American lives. An Army report later summed up their contributions. Rarely, if ever, has there been a group of such a few men who had so great an influence on the outcome of a major military campaign. After the war, the US Army acknowledged that the Ghost Army likely saved between 15,000 and 30,000 lives between May 1944 and the war's end in 1945. Their deceptions were crucial to several military victories, but their mission stayed under wraps for years. After the war, the Ghost Army soldiers returned home to work in art, fashion, theater, and media. Bound by secrecy, most didn't even tell their families about their role. It wasn't until 1996 that the full story came to light. The Ghost Army's legacy is one of ingenuity and creativity, proving that sometimes brains are just as powerful as brawn. Their work in World War II is a testament to the power of deception and the role of innovation in warfare. In 2022, the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops and the 3133rd Signal Company Special were finally awarded the Congressional Gold Medal for their extraordinary service during the war.